Deborah, like a lot of good urban designers, you've got dual qualifications. In fact, you've got dual qualifications, you've got quadruple qualifications. But one of the interesting ones is urban design, which you studied in Copenhagen in 1980. What was it like being in Copenhagen and studying urban design in that kind of decade?
Well, I thought it was absolutely fabulous. And one of the things that I really appreciated about studying urban design in Copenhagen was the approach to education. I had a choice between whether I'd like to go to the UK or to the US to study urban design, and I chose Copenhagen because I had previously already studied my undergrad architecture degree in upstate New York. I went to Copenhagen, to be quite honest, almost exhausted from having studied for 6 or 7 years already. And I met Jan Gehl. It was just before Christmas in a cold wintry night, and Jan actually came out of the Kunst Academy and said, look, you'd better have a glass of schnapps before we come in, because everyone in there was already celebrating Christmas and the holiday break. And I remember very clearly he said to me, and a number of students who were there at the time, said the most important thing about your education in Copenhagen isn't the number of essays you write, isn't actually what score you get for an assessment, but it's really about how do you learn from the people you're studying with, how do you learn from a different culture and a different place, a different focus. It's those sort of interactions, it's those sort of discussions with some of the other students who are from South America or others from Ireland or others from Spain. It was a very international group, and it was a very rich experience in discussing. The focus was always around urban design, urban issues, architecture and planning, but it was the debates and the interactions which I found really rewarding. And of course Jan Gehl's joy and enthusiasm and his experience in terms of urban design as a people skill, not a sort of a bricks and mortar skill, but as a how do you actually make places for people, which was very rewarding and enriching.
Deborah, for a lot of people, it's 2011, it's 30 years on, and it still feels like we're pushing the envelope a bit in terms of urban design in Australia. What was it like in the early 80s, talking about urban design?
I'm sure we are still pushing the envelope. I agree with you entirely. We haven't got there. There's still some way to go. There's quite considerable confusion as to what urban design is or could be, and that doesn't necessarily help. But in the 1970s and 80s, urban design was commonly regarded as a fountain. To actually be involved in urban design, everyone assumed your role was to select the paving patterns, to select the piece of sculpture which was out in the mall. It very seldom actually had much to do with buildings or architecture, and I think even today, architects still prefer urban design to be unrelated to buildings, because it gives them an angst that someone else or some other organisation might influence an iconic vision that they might want to deliver. And that's a problem, because it's not either an architect or an urban designer. There is a team that actually develops urban places. And buildings are one component, but an integral component of the greater urban fabric.
What does that mean then? You lecture in architecture and you sit on the registration board for architects in New South Wales. Is there consensus then about urban design and architecture?
No, I actually don't believe that there is consensus. There certainly isn't consensus. The question is probably to what degree of agreement is there, and even that's fairly grey. Mm. A lot of architects believe that they actually are urban designers, and they believe that by designing a building that they've actually achieved an urban design outcome. I personally believe that urban design is the design of spaces between buildings. That doesn't mean that it excludes buildings. It very much includes the buildings, because the buildings form the walls of a room, so to speak. The height of the walls are going to affect the amount of sun that comes into that room. That public space should be designed as proactively as any individual building, and not simply be left over because it seems to be outside the boundary alignment. And urban design looks at those spaces, what goes on in there, be that transport, activities such as restaurant, cafes, sitting, resting, playing, entry and exit of buildings. How do you make that room safe? And when I say room, I'm just not meaning a public plaza, I'm meaning the room of a city. That's what urban design is about. And architects do have a role to play in it, but it actually is part of the team as opposed to the skill leading the rest of the charge and everything else will just follow along behind, because it doesn't quite work that way, not if you want a good outcome.